All right. Welcome, everyone. This is really one of our last concurrent sessions for the day, and then we sort of transition to closing keynote. But the session we're all in right now is cloud hosting of business applications. Really, what finance officers or what finance needs to know. And this session is being delivered here by GP Support North. And with us today, we have Marvin Burnett and Scott Jorgens. And Marvin is the Dynamics ERP Practice Director with GP Support North. If you don't know a lot about GP Support North, they are a Canadian-based consulting firm. They have offices really throughout Canada, as I'm seeing here: Toronto, Halifax, London, and Montreal. And Scott Jorgens. Scott is the Director of Marketing with GP Support North. He's a key member of the executive team at Endeavor Solutions, GP Support North. And in addition to being a technology evangelist and client advocate, Scott manages a number of third-party partner relationships at Endeavor, including ERP cloud hosting providers and a few other sundry items. But I'll toss it over to these guys so that they can tell you a little bit more about themselves and really cloud hosting of business applications and what you need to know.
Fantastic. Thanks, Colin. So yeah, I'm Scott and Marvin here. Both of us been in the industry for 20 plus years. Our photos look a little bit younger than we are now. Endeavor and GP Support North are with 650 clients across Canada, many across Ontario, and we have some municipalities as well. Can you click on slides? Perfect. So this is what we had up on the description that encouraged you guys to attend today. And what I wanted to highlight is the first thing. Prior to the pandemic, the vast majority of our ERP business implementation of financial systems was for on-premises systems. As soon as the pandemic hit, and fast forward to today, which hopefully is post-pandemic, is 90% are now cloud-based. So there's a really huge shift, and there's a lot of market factors that have been influencing and impacting that, and that's what we're here today. Marvin's going to talk about some of the risks and obviously why financial care.
Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. Maybe I'll just do a quick poll just so I can get an understanding of the people in the audience and what some of the people are using today. Those on Zoom, you can raise your hand, but I won't see you. But for those in the group, for those in the group here, do you know what you're running? Do you know if you're running an application that is on-premise? So we're going to consider something like mission critical, like your ERP or something along those lines. Maybe just a show of hands. Okay, so that's a pretty significant number on there. Scott mentioned the pandemic, and the reality was once the pandemic hit, business changed, work environments changed. Of the people here, did you find that a lot of the, I'll say the staff, knowing that we're dealing with a lot of the finance people here, did a lot of the staff members at home work from home? Maybe just show of hands. Okay, about the same number. This last question is probably not the best phrase, but when you guys headed into the position where people were heading home, were you guys prepared? Did people have a readiness plan to say work from home, what that's going to look like? So that's the idea behind today's presentation, because as Scott mentioned, what we found is at that moment when the pandemic hit and all of a sudden people started going from work to home, everybody was prepared to be at the office, do their job from the office. And all of a sudden we found everybody now switched to home, and that really caused a pretty critical impact in the way business was operating.
Before we get too far, some quick agenda, just what we're going to focus on. I'll talk from a business perspective. What is the cloud? What are some options available? Marvin's going to talk about what's changed, the financial perspective, what's the technical, the risks, the value to your organization. We'll do a little comparison. There was a handout for those that missed it. You can get a copy on the way out, or in those that are online, I expect a PDF maybe posted along with the presentation. There are pieces of presentations released the handout, so you'll be fine to follow along after the fact. then we'll talk about the resiliency, planning for the future. So options available when it comes to running business applications, there's sort of three. On-premise, which is your site, hybrid, which is going to be some of the pieces or somewhere else, and then the cloud, especially with the SaaS, software as a service, being all up in what we call the cloud. So next. Oh, go back. Can you go back one? There was the disclaimer. So this disclaimer, if we mention the word Dynamics GP or Microsoft within our discussion today, just think of any ERP system. We're just talking about what we know because we do support Dynamics GP and clients in those realms. Next. There we go. So on-premise, you're on an island. You got your own island, it's safe, it's small. It's your people, your staff, your infrastructure, you're in charge. Obviously, there's responsibilities and costs to make sure that you're protecting your island and it's performing and servicing your user community in the best it can. The next would be a hybrid. So hybrids, let's take a piece and we're going to put it somewhere else. We're going to use some third-party infrastructure. It gets a little more crowded. There's a lot more moving pieces. There's a responsibility to be shared, a shared responsibility, your third-party provider and your own internal staff to make sure stuff can connect back and forth. So when people are working from a home office, they can connect to your in-house systems as well as these other piece of your systems. And then the third being the cloud.
This is like the longest that I haven't spoken ever. On the hybrid method also, we mentioned your ERP systems, but hybrid may also be how you're maintaining your backups. So think of it as like an Azure backup or something along those lines.
You want to take on the next one? Okay. So what is the cloud? It's a third-party data center. Real straight and simple. We used to be just called third-party data centers. Now we call it the cloud. It just seems fancier. It's up there, which is really just not in your environment. The cloud has a bundle of services, and that's the key thing that you want to be conscious of. What are the services that are being bundled? What are the additional things that were previously done by my IT staff in-house, and now are going to be done by someone else? And are there ways to mitigate our risks and control our costs? Plus, as I mentioned, the SaaS, software as a service, it almost turns into a black box, and it all magically happens. But there is always people and processes and technology behind the scenes. It's not magic. It's just pushing off who's doing what, when, why, and how. So when we think about some of the cloud-based software, that would be your Microsoft 365, your Office 365. A lot of people are moving their Exchange email servers from on-premise to the cloud because managing the on-premise was a pain in the butt for the IT people. And they're like, you know what, Microsoft can do that. They have the tools, the technology. You got your Gmail, your Dropbox. There's a lot of different cloud-based softwares where it's just there. It's not something that's purchased and installed. It's just quickly downloaded and is being able to operate for you on your behalf. So let's look at an analogy. We have Pat. Pat works for your municipality. Pat needs to have a very large package delivered to one of your locations. How's Pat going to do it? We need a driver and we need a truck. On to the next. So let's go Google or look on Bing, type in truck. What happened? Where did my picture go? There we go. What kind of truck do you need? Do you need fire suppression? Does it need extra wheels to carry a heavier load? Do you need a fancy logo so executives feel more comfortable that it's a large organization? There's a lot of different abilities and different versions of a cloud, different versions of a third-party provider. So when we get into that, now we got to click. It's, one more time, who accepts the risk? So when it's on-premise, it's your IT staff. Your IT staff also, you have to worry about, from the truck example, the gas, the mileage, the utilization, all the maintenance components. When we look into the hybrid cloud, we have sort of two versions. One would be a public cloud. This would be your Microsoft Azure or an Amazon. They're large global providers, very little risk of them going bankrupt, but also a little bit less control. The pricing is often from a package perspective, looking at the cost per kilogram, cost per package, you get a shelf within their large instance. Another option from a hybrid would be looking at a private cloud. So private cloud is usually a smaller organization. You may have more influence on the quality of the driver, the quality of the truck, mandating that they need to have a different backup schedule and be able to control and see more of those pieces. And then the fourth would be the software as a service. Those cloud providers, I think there's one more with cloud subscription. There we go. It's more of a black box. What happens is you are seeing more of the user's perspective. Sometimes there's an administration panel, but you don't have control over where is my data, where is my systems. So there's a lot of software agreements that you need to make sure that you're looking at and understanding, because there is a risk that there's some cross-border travel. On to the next. There we go. Next. So I think this is over to you, Marvin. You want to talk about some of the applications?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm just going to take one step back here for just a second. When we're talking about these different applications, we have the on-premise, we have the hybrid, we have the cloud. If we're now starting to put into perspective of our applications and our systems that we have in-house, or maybe the applications and the systems that we access is probably a better way to say it. The accessing on the on-premise, well, I have a room full of finance people, so please excuse my avoiding the whole security. But on the on-premise, you have full access to your information because you house the information. Security is going to determine who gets access to see what. On a hybrid, you're going to have partial access. So it may be dependent on the type of public or private cloud that you're putting it on. And then when we look down at that SaaS cloud model, this is where the provider is going to provide you the access that they deem you need. So whether it's just the front end application to the interface, but not the back office. So some people that may be running, I heard one of the gentlemen say he was running Dynamics GP, means you're going to have a SQL server on site somewhere. Well, you have direct access to call that information from the SQL server. In a SaaS cloud environment, you don't have access to call that information. It's just whatever the provider is letting you call. So there's going to be a couple different things when you start thinking about access on that basis, which really brings us up to some of the business applications. So now that we've sort of set a ground or a framework around what cloud, what on-prem, and what hybrid is, you start thinking about the different types of applications that you may have in your environment. Some of these may be, from the finance perspective. These are things that finance may or may not have control over, but you're starting to look at, your core, your finance, your ERP applications. You're starting to look at some of the budgeting planning tools that you may be using. You may be looking at the human resources, the reporting and analytics, all these different things that maybe finance is in control of. When you start looking at some of the business productivity tools, maybe this is your email, so Gmail or Microsoft Outlook or what have you, and then the external facing applications. So this could be a client portal or a customer portal. So you have, people that are living in the township or what have you, are they accessing, like if I joked with Scott when we were putting this slide together, I'm a little older now, but I may have gotten a few parking tickets when I was younger. If I would have had a portal to log on to pay the parking tickets, maybe I would have paid them easier or quicker. Maybe I wouldn't have. But still, these are some of the external facing applications. So as you start going through the journey of looking, are we looking to move from maybe an on-premise, which there was a number of people in this room that were on-premise, and start thinking about maybe I need to move and look towards going either hybrid or cloud. You have to really start making an inventory of what you have to determine what can move, what should move, and what is even capable of moving. So this brings me to the next point on why finance should care. There's going to be a couple different areas that we want to talk about. We've got the technology, we've got the risk, and we've got the value. So the cost benefit of moving to a cloud-based application. So under the technology area, there's a number of points that we put down. The first 2 points that we're talking about here are really scalability. So what is scalability? That's being able to plan for today's demand and future demand. So the infrastructure that I have in place, does it have the capacity to grow? Let's say 2 municipalities are going to join together and share resources, or they're going to, municipalities merge or what have you. Do I have the capacity right now on my existing servers to actually accommodate additional people moving into that environment, or additional resources, or additional applications? The next one that we want to start thinking about is the cash flow. So what is going to be the cost of moving from an on-prem or moving from the current environment to a cloud-based environment? So on this basis, we're talking, is it going to be an outflow or a cash outflow at a certain period when we're buying it? Like, let's say it's a $250,000, purchase, because on-prem you're purchasing the software more often than a SaaS model, which is what a cloud is, which becomes a subscription. So now for my budgeting process, I've got these large amounts that are all of a sudden hitting, every 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it is that you're planning for, compared to that annuity style where you're just paying a subscription each month. As well as the organization changes, how easy and how quick is it to scale up? So now this budgeting and cash flow starts tying back into our scalability. If we add another user, is it just simply a new subscription that we have to acquire? Or does it now change? We've now hit our max on our infrastructure. We've now got to start considering some new hardware potentially. The next couple points really talk about, future updates. So when you start looking at something like an on-premise solution compared to a cloud-based solution, on-premise solution, you're usually starting to do your planning, your setting things up. So going forward in the future, you have planned for the upgrade. The upgrades often carry a lot of enhancements, a lot of functionality and everything that you're looking to add into your environment. We started the slide deck earlier with that talk about the pandemic. I hear it all the time. So, it's just one of those things that you start living with after a while. But one of the things that really started to happen when the pandemic kicked in is all of a sudden, like we look at Scott and Marvin, like Marvin's the payables person, Scott's the manager. If I'm starting to enter payables, the old process used to be, I used to just walk the payables over, put them on Scott's desk. Scott used to just review them, approve them, reject them, walk them back to me. When everybody started going home, all of a sudden that process, there was a pretty critical impact or a shift in what that process was. And now if we have systems that are on premise, we have to start thinking about the impact of that and how easy it is to put something in place to automate workflows, automate OCR functionality, so on and so forth. So that's going to tie into the process automation and the longevity. The insurance compliance, well, this is, talking about the vulnerability and the compliance of your current system. So if you do have an on-premise system, how open is it to the outside world? How open is it to those cyber threats? When you talk to your insurance provider, I believe, Scott, you mentioned last year, there was actually one of the presenters was an insurance provider. He said that he anticipated about half of the people, a significant number of the people in the group that may not even be eligible for cyber insurance because of the legacy of their applications and the legacy of their hardware. So it's different things that you want to talk or consider. Disaster response. So what happens if a server dies? I know Scott's probably going to kill me because I go into little stories all the time, but he wants to keep me on pace. It was about a month, I think it was about a month or a month and a half ago at Endeavor, where Scott and I work, we actually had, we use GP in-house and it's on-prem. We actually had one of our hard drives down. But as part of our IT strategy, we actually have redundant backups going up to Azure. So we have like a hybrid method where we're actually moving some of our information into the cloud. So for our backups. For us, the IT people got involved. The reality was first thing in the morning, they looked at it, they analyzed, they determined the critical path was, we're not getting the server back. It smells like it just fried last night. So they made the decision, all right, let's get another environment spun up. And our finance people were back online within the same day. So horrible example, but at the same time, it's really good to share with because it is a real example that happens. Then, of course, I mentioned security, talking about the insurance and everything along those lines. And it's something that you really have to think about. How open, how vulnerable is our applications that we have if we are in an on-premise environment, considering moving to the cloud.
Now it's my turn. Next slide. So what I have here is it's a two-part thing, looking from left to right, sort of the who, what, where, why, when. What has really changed? So a lot of the on-prem applications were designed Y2K, pre-Y2K, a little bit after that. But our main concerns were, we went into the office, we did work. So when it comes to authentication, it was simple passwords, we were in the office. Now we're getting to be more complex. The devices, we access them on PC, on a desk. Now we have home office. Can I have one more click? So really what a lot of that has changed is the when. No longer just during working hours. We're now 24/7, 365. And the where. We're exposing applications through portals, through work from home, through e-commerce that are now up into the web, and they can be accessed 24/7, 365 from anywhere. The evildoers, those that were causing mischief. Back in the 90s, it was, oh, I got a little virus and I can't press the letter T on my typewriter. They're mischief type stuff. Once in a while, there was some that were fraud-based, but a lot of the viruses and computer stuff, really, it was an annoyance. Now we have ransomware. We have sophisticated hackers. There's actually government-funded organizations around the world trying to make our lives miserable. And so we have to protect these applications. Even if they were built in this time, not necessarily designed for the future, there are ways that we can leverage some outside resources to be able to lock those pieces down and be able to keep things secure. Here.
So the next area that we want to talk about is risk mitigation. So inside risk, there's sort of two areas that we often see people talk about. There's going to be that technology risk and then process risk. So technology risk, we've already talked a lot about security, or a bit about security and cyber insurance and compliance along those lines. Then we also have infrastructure failure. So the technology risk, what happens? Do I have a disaster recovery plan? Sort of joked in one of those polls saying, did people plan for the pandemic? Hopefully the answer is no, because people shouldn't plan for a pandemic, or hopefully not many people. But you should all be thinking about the infrastructure failure and planning for, at Endeavour, a hard drive failure. We had a plan in place. It was very quick for us to get up and running. The next part is that process risk. Now, this is going to go back to a little bit of what Scott was talking about fraud protection, IT project success, and subscription terms. We'll get into that in a second. But then there's the business interruption piece. So we've got, let's say if our hard drive fails, we lose our server. Do we have a plan in place to get people up and working again? So this is going to be that business interruption that comes into play. What is the impact going to be? Is it a critical thing that it happens? What happens if we're down for a day? What happens if we're down for 3 days? What happens if we're down for a week? So it's starting to think about all those pieces in place and started to put that, like, what happens given my current infrastructure? When we look at that, inventory of what we have I made a plan for this? What happens if there is some kind of failure that comes in? We're also looking at things like subscription terms, so the process risk. So we're not only talking about on-premise solutions, but we're also talking about, we need to set up a subscription, or we want to start moving to the cloud for maybe a new budgeting system. Well, if we're starting to look at that, is there any terms that are put in place with this? So do they require that we have a 3-year term, a 2-year term, or is it a pay per month? So these are things that you want to consider, because not only is it going to be the price of the subscription, but is there any cancellation fees or anything? So it's not just the costs, the hard and soft costs on the on-premise side, but you want to consider the hard and soft costs on the subscription side as well, or the hybrid model. So you want to be considering all those. The third pillar that we're going to talk about is the value to the organization. So the value to the organization, this is what you would look at if I'm moving from one application or from one platform to another. So if I was moving from on-prem and moving over to cloud. So how quick is it going to be adopt and put the function, measuring the quality, the soft and hard risks, the automation versus manual processes. So these are looking at some of the values of what moving to the cloud would be. The total cost of ownership. We actually have a slide deck, and I think it was part of the handout, Scott, that helps sort of work through some of the budgeting process. There's some of the things that you should consider when moving your applications, or if you are considering moving your applications, because you really do want to go into this with your eyes open. You don't want to go into it and 3 years down the road go, oh wow, this was a lot more expensive than I thought it would be. Have that plan in place and have that action to actually look at what the costs are going to be. There's also the short-term versus long-term. So this is the, is this aligning to the vision? Over the last couple years, actually the last number of years, one of the most common things that I've seen in either business or organizations is when a new director, a new senior manager, a new person comes into the organization and they step in and they turn around and say, you know what, I have a mandate that we go to the cloud. So that just, they walk in and they say, we're going to the cloud. And they don't actually talk to the staff, the other users of the applications and find out, can we go to the cloud? So this is going to be that short-term versus long-term. So it becomes part of your planning and strategy down the road. Now, this also aligns with, oh, sorry, I'll just go back one step. This also aligns with a paper, an article that CPA put out a little while ago. We'll be able to send a link out, I believe, after on this. But it was considerations of moving to the cloud. So it's not just, you know, average people that are talking about it or just different people in organizations. This is something that CPA Canada is talking about. And they found that when working with members in business and different CPAs through their membership, that some of the most prevalent things that were coming up and being discussed about people thinking and discussing and considerations of moving to the cloud was such things as location. You know, where is my data? So it's one of those things that if I have a mandate that says my data has to be housed in Canada, when you're considering moving to the cloud, you have to ask those questions of the cloud providers. Where's my data going to be held? Because if you remember those earlier points where we talked about if it's on-prem, you have full access to your data. The reality is if it's on-prem, it's in that little box in the corner. That's where your data is. But as soon as you move into cloud, you're going through a web-based application to access your data. Well, the data is not actually in the cloud. It's in a data center somewhere. Where is that data center? You know, I don't want to pull up the Patriot Act, but it comes up in conversation more often than not. A number of organizations, unless you ask, you don't realize that your data is actually being held in the US. It opens itself up to the Patriot Act. Another one would be like, how secure is my data? So I've got this concept of public cloud. How am I logging in? I'm logging in over a web page. Does that mean anyone can log over a web page? This goes back to one of the things Scott was talking about earlier, maybe multi-factor authentication. So those different levels of authentication and security. You want to make sure you're asking these questions. You can also take a look at this in sort of a two-part. You know, how secure is my data and who can access my data? You know, prior when it was in that box in the corner, I know who could access it. It's somebody inside the building because that's where it was being held, unless we had outward facing as we moved to people working from home. But now that it's in a public cloud, who has access to my data? Like, is it the data providers also? You also want to start to consider, or CPA found that a lot of members were asking, how much is it going to cost? So this is going into the whole project or the whole shift with your eyes open, knowing what the total costs are going to be. And then another one of the questions was, have I thought of everything about moving? So it's always good to ask other organizations that may have moved already, or ask other people that you know that have made that switch. What were some of the things, what were some of the pitfalls that you came across when you were making this plan or making this move from one place, from an on-prem to a cloud, or making that switch between platforms?
Exactly right on time. Good job.
So opportunities and planning for future resiliency.
Let's talk about the consumerization of IT. It's a fun term. It's really saying there's all these companies around the world globally making software to make it easy for consumers to use them. We can download apps on our phone. They're easy to use. They don't need a training manual. They don't need a 10-day course. And they magically update whenever they're needed. All of that is coming into the enterprise space, has been and continues to be, which is making municipal applications that much easier to buy, that much easier to install, that much easier to update and maintain. When they're up in the cloud and partially controlled and maintained by that cloud provider, then a lot of that stuff really happens automatically. And these are things to see as a trend towards how you may be shifting your costs and shifting responsibilities as you look to applications you have now that will move into a hybrid, or new applications you buy in a SaaS that will replace the older applications. There's a lot of pressure around, you know, the consumers or citizens and even your internal employees. If I can buy theater tickets on my phone, why can't I pay my parking ticket on my phone? So there's a lot of that demand, and that's opening up really a trend that we're seeing within public sector and municipalities is how can we get more online services to be able to support our citizens out through a citizen portal, virtual city hall, those types of aspects. We're seeing trends around greater integration of business applications. Integration is important because that's really all that means is one data from one system is talking to data from another system. If I have an online portal and I'm exposing a virtual city hall out to my citizens, they want to be accessing potentially 4 or 5 different applications of backend and in that consolidated view. And so there's some integrations and behind the scenes that need to be put into place. And so there's a technical side, but also the business side. Back to what Marvin was saying, who has access to that data, which data can be moved back and forth. And honestly, it comes down to which version of the truth are we going to follow. If we have multiple data across different systems, how do they know which is the right data? We don't want to be caught in that. The subscriptions is obviously something we talked about, and increased security controls. Marvin, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, you know what? It is a discussion that a lot of organizations, and I hate going back to this whole thought about the pandemic, but it has become more in light because the moment when everybody started going home to work from home, the discussion really flipped. And that's what we found when we were talking with clients, just different people, just working in industry. We really found that people, probably much like yourself in the room here and online, that the discussion went from, I need to be able to switch from what I have right now to something that's easier and quicker, because the reality is there's going to be a hybrid work method, or the reality is going to be people do work from home now. The hours of work have shifted. All of those things have now become far more prevalent and far more talked about.
Yeah, and along those lines, we're seeing it ourselves. There's a lot of cool stuff that, the SAPs of the world and the large tier 1 municipalities have been enjoying for years. And now with a subscription, it's becoming a lot more affordable, and they're simplifying some of those applications where the mid-market organizations and smaller organizations can be doing many of the same things. The technology is caught up where, scanning invoices and OCR technology was, basically, you were showing me last night, he had Google Translate on his phone, and through the camera, the phone was reading text and on screen showing a picture of the text and French on top. So he's translating his daughter's French homework, going, here's something printed, here's what it says in English, back and forth with his phone. The technology is just so quick and cool. Now we can do that, scan my invoices, shove it in my system. Give me approvals that are working remote over email because no one's in the office. We can't drop off that stack of paper. So there's a lot of cool stuff that's going on. Why don't we go on to the next slide? Just keep me honest. On to there. Next. I have a technical slide, and then we'll get into a little bit easier date. But basically, if you have on-site infrastructure and on-site applications, sometimes there's issues with the quality. So it's getting older. We got older machines. They have a lifespan. Security may be a bit weaker. There may be backup concerns. Now we can look at replacing some of that. Give me another click. And why don't we just click one at a time as I go through them. So you can get new on-prem, and you can fix all your problems with new on-premise applications and on-premise servers, or you can start looking at moving some of those to the cloud. So click. You can have faster machines. You can have extra strong IT tools. You can have greater remote access to all your users. You can have stronger zero trust approach. Zero trust basically means I trust no one. If you're in the office or out of the office, if you're an analyst or the CFO or another individual, I need you to authenticate. I need you to only access information that you should be accessing. And even more so, if you are in doing stuff and you have full access to the system, can we have restricted access so that a person who approves the checks can't also print them for themselves? You can't change a vendor deposit for electronic funds transfer to your own personal banking account. And if it does, I need an audit trail and I need an alert to say, hey, something changed. That's what zero trust means. And that can happen with current applications. You reconfigure, you put in little extra tools and fix it, or into some of the newer cloud-based SaaS applications. They see that there's these issues and therefore solving them. On to the next, redundancy and backup. Marvin talked about, you can back up on-premise to the cloud or internal. The key here is the pricing. So capital expenditure and IT effort for on-premise, potentially variable fixed fee, a little more predictable for when you move into cloud applications. You do still have to look at that break even. If I have an application and I'm buying and I'm going to keep it for 6 years, is the break even point in the cost at 6 years, or is it 3? And if the break even is at 3 years, that means you're paying double for the similar application, similar service in a 6-year period. So you do need to look at those timelines. And that's where we come into the next slide. And we'll keep going. Let's go through this. So yes, we get more security, more financial charges. Keep going. We'll keep going. Keep going. Let's look right into the business case scenario and get into the components. Next, if you could. So we have some numbers we're going to feed in. Yep, that's fine. I just wanted to show that there are numbers. We don't need to look specifically at them, but the scenario that are in the printout and that we'll go through here is looking at 8 users. That's 8 users in your finance. Obviously, your municipality, you got hundreds of employees, or could be a smaller one, 50 employees. But the core finance team is usually accessing your ERP system. And we're going to go through what does it look for on-premise versus a hybrid cloud versus a private cloud, and even towards if it was full software as a service, just to sort of expose you to some of those different levers that you look at when we build a business case. Next. So it's going to look like this, and I'm going to zoom in. So next, here we go, on-premise. So up at the top is if I need to buy new hardware. So I'm going from the old hardware, I'm going to the new hardware. The new hardware is going to be faster, better, more secure, et cetera, et cetera. If all your IT labor costs are considered sunk costs, which isn't a good analysis, but you could just basically say, you know, I have my new box, and my cost per box is going to last for 48 months. So my annual cost, my monthly cost is going to be about 570. Oh, can I use the dot? I got walk and talk and chew gum and okay, this is gonna be tricky. So if we look at our IT costs, we're conservative looking at an internal fully burdened rate. There's IT monitoring that needs to happen. There's staff response time that needs to happen. The response time is not only if something breaks, but also if an evildoer makes it into the systems or there's attacks. In IT staff training, we were quite conservative here. There's a number of courses that our people are taking, and it's like a $5,000 course, $6,000 course. Like there's a lot of knowledge that you want to make sure that your individuals understand and are able to obviously retain those individuals so they can use that new training. Oh, I was going to say next. If we look at the private clouds, this is the hybrid. This is, I own my software, but I'm just going to put it on someone else's box, but I want to bundle it with those services. Shared services. Thank you, Marvin. With those shared services, and with those, much of that is included. If we look at, so it's the same thing, the hybrid cloud into that public, into the Azure, there is a ton of complexity with the public cloud Azure. If your team knows what they're doing, many of those costs, you can consider them like sunk costs. But if you're new to moving to a public cloud, there is costs related to monitoring. It's not as magical as it seems. You need to know what you're doing. So people need to have that training. They need to have that monitoring. They need to be able to work with these new tool sets. There are providers as well that can just take that off and just add a little extra onto that fee. And then we compare it to a software as a service. I'm just going to buy a new application. I'm going to replace this application with the new one. There is implementation costs for the new one. But if we look at just from a hosting perspective, when it's a cost per user and everything else is this black box and included, yes, it looks like it costs more, but this includes our software. So for many that are on Dynamics GP, you know, you could be at a hosting fee, but then you're also, you know, an extra 15, 20 grand a year for your software maintenance fee to maintain and be allowed to do updates and other stuff like that. So there is some fun analysis that you can do. And this is what is on the handout. For those that didn't get the handout that are online, it's a screenshot of the screen. So you'll be able to see that in the presentation. How am I doing for timing? I think you got about 15 minutes. Do you want to hear him talk for about 10 minutes and we'll have 5 for questions? Perfect. Over to you.
Thanks, Scott. So I would like to just do a quick recap of some of the things that we had talked about. So this is part of the planning for future resiliency. So earlier in the presentation, we had gone through this slide deck where we had said, you know what, let's take a look at what applications we're using. So this is, you know, in terms of speaking finance, this is your inventory. This isn't like the traditional, you know, what pieces of inventory you have in stock, but this is what pieces of inventory you have in terms of application, in terms of hardware. When you're making that consideration, moving from one method to another, so if we're moving from on-prem to cloud, because that's really what a lot of organizations are looking at these days, you have to start looking at, we'll go back through this, you have to start looking at what the different users are, what the different applications are, and where they're being held. So we have those things that are sitting on a server right now. The server is going to have maybe multiple servers. Maybe there's an Active Directory server, maybe there's a SQL server, maybe there is a client server. So you're going to have to start looking at where the different applications are. You also have to start taking an inventory of what applications you're using. So I mentioned earlier, I saw or heard one person mention they're using Dynamics GP. Dynamics GP is an on-prem application. I know that because we use it at our office. What does that mean? Dynamics GP being an on-prem application meets only two of the requirements. It meets the ability, or meets only two of the abilities. It only has the ability to either be on-prem or hybrid. So what that means is I own the application. I cannot put it in cloud because there is no cloud-facing application available. So what I'm saying here is when you take a look at the applications that you're using in-house, take a look at if there is even a cloud offering available for that application. If there isn't, and your mandate, because the new director came in and said we have a mandate to move to cloud, you're now looking at a mandate to move to a new ERP system as well, potentially. So you got to start taking into account all these different applications. And everyone in the room, if we're all part of finance, you realize that, you know, the traditional role that you played, you know, doing the debits and credits when you first started in this industry has changed. You're now starting to delve more into the applications and understanding what people are using. So this is really that inventory checklist that you're starting to take note of. The second piece is, you know, when we're talking about ERPs and stuff, that's a unique group, a distinct group that's using it. You're next going to start looking at those business productivity applications. So that's our email. So everybody in the organization has email. So these are the different pieces that you have to start taking inventory of and what they're using. So do I have the ability to move my email to Office 365, Gmail, G Suite, whatever it is that we're looking at? And then we also have to say, what about our external facing applications? Do they interact with our internal? So not only are we talking about moving applications to the cloud, but if we have external applications and it's talking to our on-prem application right now, what's the impact of those if I move to another platform? So it used to talk to the server that was in-house. I've now moved the server. Is it a simple read point to where it's talking to? Or if I've moved to cloud, are these even compatible to talk to each other? So these are a lot of the things that people are starting to look at and starting to take note of, or they should be if they are looking at that change going from, as I mentioned, on-prem to cloud. So it is very important because this all goes back to business interruption. If we said, all right, let's move these things, but we missed the fact that we have an external facing application that was bill payments. So I talked about my parking tickets when I was younger. If that application used to talk to our on-prem application, all of a sudden I moved it, finance is going to be pretty angry when all that revenue starts disappearing from the books. Well, I shouldn't say that. It doesn't disappear from the books, but they're going to have to go through a lot more reconciliations to figure out what happened. And then it's going to be more of a reactive stage where you're trying to get those applications connected again. Yes, it can, and it often has. Another thing that we want to talk about is, you know, different things to plan for the future. So we've got the security and infrastructure. So this is where I was talking about, does my application that I have currently meet the requirements? If I change or if my organization grows, can my infrastructure handle that change? Our decision matrix for technology, so our timeline and our horizon. So it's great to say, I want to move to the cloud, but the reality is that doesn't happen overnight. So what we have to do is we have to start considering, if we are going to make this change, how long is it gonna take? What's the impact on our security? As well, we have to do contract reviews, because if we are moving to the cloud, go into it with your eyes open, understand what the costs are, understand if there's any penalties if you decide that you needed to change when you went into it. Business applications for automation, so opportunities for value. So one of the things that I always mention, because working in this industry for as long as I have, there's a lot of people that have come, I hate going back to this pandemic thing, but I keep having to go back to it. A lot of organizations were like, you know what, Marvin moved back to his home office, we'll call it, and now Marvin has to do a check run, but Scott has to sign the checks. We don't even have EFT in place. How hard is it for our current application to make that change quickly? Or we take into account the timeline to make that change? And can that application even adopt to that change? So these are some of the things that you really want to take into consideration when you're putting that inventory together of what applications, what hardware, what software you have in place, and what it's going to take to move from where you're at now to where you want to be.
Wrap it up. Oh. Thank you. We can open up for Q&A. We do have a cool white paper, business transformation, free. It's on the homepage of our website. Rather than being too salesy, just Google GP Support North. You can find it. It can talk about just about any application, any of the concepts we did cover today. Questions? Yes, sir. Wait for the runner. Here's the mic.
Hello?
Hello.
I have a few. I don't know if I should just ask them all or.
Ask
Okay.
the best one first.
So I'll ask, I think there's 3 or 4. So do ERPs require or allow supervisor password approval to proceed or just tracking of actions so that security and internal controls can be proactive instead of responsive? How do we know data is secure and not being monetized by the cloud hosting company or their staff, such as what happened at Twitter, where they sold user identifications and things to foreign security agencies, and then those people disappeared? How can we be sure their staff cannot go in and change their property tax data to show their property taxes are paid when they were not? Or offer to sell this as a service like staff at Instagram did when they were selling blue check marks for thousands of dollars to people who didn't deserve it or qualify? How do we know that they don't change where the data is stored or quality of storage because it's convenient for them by just changing the terms of service at their own whim? And what about dealing with the cost of downtime? So recently, Rogers had their telephones go down for what, a week? Oh, well, sometimes they'll just say, well, it was just a day or two, so you'll get 365 of your fee refunded. But if we can't take tax payments for 2 weeks, that's a little bit more devastating and it has public implications. And if a cloud hosting company says, well, it's only like 2 weeks, and we'll just refund you, 1/24 of a year of service or something like that.
Yes, that is quite a laundry list, and there are concerns. It really comes down to the planning in choices, and you don't have to move everything all to one provider and not everything all to the cloud. There are some systems you can keep in-house, and there could be legacy applications that are potentially good for another 5-10 years. And you may consider that hybrid cloud hosting. So you're taking something that was on-premise and putting it into a third-party provider so they can watch it, but not be accessing the specific data. Some of your concerns were around process. That comes to leadership, that comes to your internal processes in terms of how the system is configured, what kind of audit trails you're running, what kind of alerts and triggers you have to ensure that individuals aren't changing doing that white collar crime internally. There are, from a GP perspective, there's add-on software that they can add on top of the old systems, and then many of the new ones have some of those fraud protection built in. So that answers some of that.
I don't remember every question you asked, I'll be honest. A couple of the questions that did stand out, though, was the auditability of the transactional data. I think the first question was, how do we track if somebody changes the data, information along those lines? Typically, what I've seen is that is going to be more I'll say that there's two layers to this. There's going to be application specific. So is there an audit traceability in the application? So if you think about the nature of a database, the database has changes. So there's going to be a before and after change. Is there going to be a table that's writing that information? I can go into specific applications that don't, specific applications that do, but then I would be getting probably far too specific. But it's going to be definitely one of the questions that you want to ask the provider that you're looking at going forward with software. And you want to get it in writing as well. So do I have that audit traceability? This is then going to turn into more of a training aspect, because you're going to want to set up either training on how to turn on that application. You're going to want to have security around who has access to turn it on and off, or the ability not to turn it off at all. And then you're going to want to be able to do I'm going to call it an internal audit of that functionality. So that functionality itself, did I see I hate using this example, but it's probably the best example. We moved over to EFT. I need to be able to see that what was the bank account before. I need to see that Scott logged into the application. He changed the bank account number to something else, and then he changed it back to the original. So when the EFT run was done, did it print off Scott, or did it generate an electronic file that was uploaded to the bank that went to Scott's bank account instead of to Rogers? Yeah, and that's where I was going with.
Couldn't advance alone. When I worked in a bank, you could not advance a loan without a supervisor over it, somebody else providing their password. And what you're providing is, oh, well, we can track what somebody did, but the money's already gone.
That's part one. So the second part is being proactive and preventing somebody from being able to do it in the first place. So then you get into I'll call it the accounting principle of segregation of duties. So now you have different functions inside the application. You want to make sure that the application has the ability to segregate the duties inside of its functions. So you have one person that's able to do that EFT run, but another person that's able to set up and change the vendor. On that, you also want to layer it with workflow. So workflow is where it's going to say, all right, Marvin's entering the payable, Scott's entering the check run, and Steve's the one who's in charge of approvals of any changes or any updates to it. So prior to the check run being done, if Scott wanted to do an update to it, he doesn't have the ability to actually set the update in place. So it's tracking that on a database level that says it is moved to, but I'm not going to put it in place. So I'm not going to actually apply that setting until the approval's been set. And then you want to have an audit traceability of that approval. So that's where I was going. There's sort of two parts. There's the, visibility of what was changed. So whether it was changed before, because there may be circumstances where that vendor has to have their banking information changed. So you want that functionality to exist. But at the same time, you've got that second layer of workflow being applied to it to say, before this change can even happen, I don't want the supervisor to change it. I want the supervisor to approve it. That's where workflow kicks in. And then you have the audit trail of what that workflow was. So Scott made a change. He submitted it to Steve. Steve at 10:30 in the morning on September 23rd approved it, put it into place. Does that make sense, or is that more aligned with what you're asking?
Online banking for commercial.
Yep.
Even though we required 2 signatures, what they did was they made it so that one person could do all the transfers. So I could have effectively transferred millions of dollars out to somewhere, left the organization, and I don't know, moved to Costa Rica, which doesn't have an extradition treaty. So that became a big issue. And actually, they did have to respond to it because
I was going to say
some
banks have
places
actually,
unwittingly gave it to a junior employee and millions were transferred out.
Yeah, I believe that, I'm not going to speak for all banks, but I believe that issue has been addressed because a number of the organizations we talk with actually have that, I'll call it that second layer. So we have the ERP application that says, here's the banking information that we're generating from the inside. So we're going to create that EFT, that payment run that gets pushed up to the bank. Then on the banking side, there's a there's a 2-person authentication that can be set to say there's 2 layers of security here. Plus, they're also going to put in place like an RSA or a multi-factor authentication that says, Steve and Bob are the 2 people that have to go in. They have multi-level, multi-factor authentication. That's it. When Bob logs in, it's going to send an email to his phone and say, did you actually just log in? Or something along those lines. So I understand what your question is. And I think we're talking about a couple different layers here in terms of security and auditability. So there's going to be security on the application that you as an organization is using. Then there's going to be security on the level of the bank that ties back to your organization. So it's going to be, once again, when banking agreements are set up, you set up who the authorized parties are, and then you set up that multi-factor authentication so that when they are approving payments being run through, it has all the authentication it requires.
And there are best practices and guidance from additional consulting firms that have been through this with multiple clients that can help out. Another question?
I was just curious, as a small municipality with limited IT resources, how does staff capacity work into the decision to go on cloud or not?
Pretty easy. It's there's a lot less you need to do if someone else is managing your applications. So it's going to come down to a cost of, is it one individual or two individuals? And if you needed the third, are you realizing that opportunity cost of avoiding the third hire because you've offset that with cloud, or you have an individual that's about to retire and you go down from two individuals down to one? Especially in finance, we're finding more and more, we actually just had an article the other day of a desire for the younger individuals and for all individuals to have more analysis, to have some fun work, not just boring work. And so if you want them to be able to do analysis, make recommendations, do thoughts, you need to free up their time. And that's where some of the process automation comes in. So with the AP automation, the PO requisition automation, the expense reimbursement automation, the AR payment automation, the collections management automation, there's automation for everything. And it's really trying to move more stuff to self-service and then having those automated workflows and checks and balances and easy to view, easy to use applications, and firing emails back and forth saying, okay, here's the expense statement, here it is. The system says all the checks are there. Do you believe this? Yes, approve. And then it all happens. Next question. Up to the front. And time check, we got about 4 minutes.
Yeah, we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. So who? Oh.
So my initial thought was that eventually I think we'd all have to move to the cloud. But just looking at your title, the white page or white paper, it seems like maybe that's not the case. So I guess my thoughts, or wanted to know your thoughts, because a lot of the municipalities use Microsoft Dynamics. And I'm hearing different opinions on whether or not they're going to sunset or renew the contract with Microsoft. And just want to get your opinion on whether that's, if it's inevitable that we'll have to find something else, or whether it really is some time to figure out our next steps.
Sure. We do have additional information on the website, but the official Microsoft for Dynamics GP is to 2028 and beyond. I'm told it's with a capital B for beyond. That being said, I don't believe there's any ERP software companies making new on-premise applications. So eventually, not sure when, but eventually an application will be too old for a variety of reasons. Could be it doesn't work with the infrastructure. It could be just all the cool new best practice features around workflow are just bundled in with a new application. It's just that much better. You'd be silly to not to. There's concerns with just staff retention and hiring. Some people want to work with cool stuff, not necessarily stuff that just works and you're happy with.
Yeah. First of all, finance is cool. It's not fun stuff. It's all cool. But in regards, so your question was more in specific to Dynamics, probably Dynamics GP, probably with Diamond Municipal layered on top of it. So the official statement from Microsoft is that they are continuing to support till 2028. Microsoft doesn't put a roadmap out beyond 6 years for any of their applications. So from our standpoint, from what we're hearing from Microsoft, it's still going to be supported, continued past that. The second piece, now from my experience, I've been working in the, I'll say the dynamic space it's since the 90s, so we'll say a couple of years now. And I've seen that
It was on a floppy disk.
It actually was. It was a 5.25 too. It wasn't the 3.5. But from my perspective, what I've been seeing in the industry over the years, and more specific from a Microsoft standpoint, they've spent time rebranding. So if you've been with Microsoft or GP, you've known that it started out as GPA, GP, Great Plains, Dynamics GP, Dynamics Great Plains. They've changed names. One of the things that they've been doing also is they've been having the code or the information in the background. So they went from a version information to a year information because it was GP 2010, 2012, 2015, so on and so forth. And then what Microsoft has done is if you watch the other applications and the other platforms, the ones that you know that they're going to start to twilight a little bit more, they leave them on the legacy naming convention. But the ones that they are still actively working towards, they continue on with their modern lifecycle names. So GP actually changed its version information from 2010 to 2018. Then all of a sudden they hit the modern lifecycle where they went 18.2.4 plus whatever, and they had the minor builds. So from my perspective, the fact that they've done this in the background, like if they would have said that, yeah, we're going to continue 2028, but left it at GP 2018, I would have got a little more nervous going, yeah, that's a pretty good indication having done this for 25 years that you're saying this, but you're going to, at that point, leave it. But because they've actually changed the modern lifecycle name, gives me more reassurance that they're planning to continue on. There's also, it's just common sense. Microsoft's a for-profit business. GP is the largest business solution that they have in North America. Microsoft doesn't want to throw all the revenues from that away, so they'll continue on. I think it'll be more of a change of the business that causes it to twilight, because as more businesses come on board and they focus more on the SaaS or the cloud-based solution, that's when they'll start to make a decision to twilight more. But at this point, I don't see it.
Thank you. Yep, time. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions, but I'm sure you guys will be here at least clearing up.
Yep.
So if anybody wants to come up, on behalf of MFOA, I want to say thank you, Scott, Marvin, for sharing your extensive expertise on the subject with our members. And on behalf of MFOA, thank you very much. We've made a donation in both of your names to Feed Ontario. So thank you very
Excellent.
much.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it. Everybody else,